Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is John. I'm the product manager from Arc Health. Very excited to have you joining us tonight for tonight's webinar, brought to you by Arc Health in partnership with Paradise Dental Technologies, or PDT. And also a very special welcome to both Elizabeth Knoll and Whitney Howerton. We do appreciate for you taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend. Please note the duration of the webinar is 1 hour. Tonight, I'd like to welcome a very, very special guest and great business partner from PDT, Whitney Howerton. Whitney is an accomplished clinician, educator, and international speaker, very passionate about helping dental professionals get the very best from their instruments. So Whitney will be sharing practical insights and proven techniques in her session, Essential Instruments and Sharpening Success. So this will, as Whitney outlined before, this will be a very interactive and engaging session. So please feel free to use the chat box or Q&A box throughout the webinar, and we'll make sure to get as many questions answered as possible. Everyone registered tonight will also go into the draw to win one of 10 limited edition PDT Moose. So stay till the end to see if you're one of the lucky winners, because I'll be announcing the winners then. Once again, a very warm welcome to each of you. Let's get started, and I'll hand over to Whitney to take us through this exciting and valuable session.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, Arc Health, for inviting PDT and Elizabeth and I to be here. So like John said, this class is going to be all about instrumentation and instrument sharpening. And both are definitely a passion of mine as a dental hygienist. So let's kick it off. So also something about kind of about the title of the class is it's really my goal for you all, though we do have objectives, right? Because every course has them. My goal is for you all to really elevate your clinical confidence, whether that's in your instrument selection or that's in your, sharpening abilities. So if you learn about one instrument that you've never heard of before, then I'm going to feel accomplished this evening. Okay. So that's my goal for you all. John did a great introduction, so I'm absolutely not going to review or read this, but a little bit more about my background. I work as adjunct faculty at the University of Tennessee here. I'm actually based in Tennessee, so it's early morning for me, but I'm very, very happy to be with you all. And I'll actually be in Australia with John and some other members of the Arc Health team at the what is it, John? I always want to say it wrong, but
OHAA on the Gold Coast in middle of
yeah.
October.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to that. So if you're going to attend that conference, please swing by the booth, come say hello in person. I'd love to meet you in person and help answer your questions, and we can play with some instruments in person. So I absolutely love being a dental professional. I've been a clinician for 15 years, and I've had a chance to work with Elizabeth for probably 5 or 6 of those years. So she's always been a great partner to me, and I'm happy to be at PDT. So we do have objectives. We're going to learn about instruments. We're going to learn about selection, why the choice that we make matters. And then we're also going to look at instrument sharpening. So before we get started, because we only have an hour, we want to go quickly back to the basics. So think about, some of your very first lessons, in school when you were learning about just general, well, after hand washing, right? That was always one of the first things that we learned was how to wash our hands, how to be safe with our patients. But as we shifted our studies into instrumentation, you have to think about the basics, and the basics still matter after you have years of clinical practice. It still matters because the design of the instrument impacts how and where you can use it. So in particular, when we look at just the general terminology that you're going to hear me use throughout the course this evening is you want to remember those very, very common terms and areas. So if you look at the image to the left, you have a tip or a toe, right? Depending on whether it's a sickle or a curette or an area specific curette. You also have the back of the instrument. And when we get into sharpening toward the end of the course, you're going to hear me talk about the back of the instrument a bit more. You have the face. So if you're looking down at the instrument, you would be looking at the face of the instrument. You have that lateral side. You've got the full length of the blade. Of course, you've got that tip or toe, middle, and heel of the blade or cutting edge. And then you also shift down into the terminal shank. So we're going to talk about terminal shank quite a bit. And you would not believe the number of clinicians that I have a chance to speak with that when I say, well, the terminal shank is longer or the terminal shank is curved. So let's go with something that's straight. And I kind of see a look of like confusion on their face, or they're kind of be like, the what? So those terms kind of, I guess, fall to the wayside sometimes, right? We've practiced for several years, we pick up what we know and love, and we kind of just we forget the basics. If we look at the image to the right, you see the cutting edge there highlighted in white. You see the width of the blade in blue. Again, you see the length and the thickness. And I wanted to go ahead and indicate shine on this one. And we'll talk about that a bit more when we talk about the sharpening aspect. But I've practiced clinically now for 15 years. And so when I learned how to sharpen instruments, I was not taught to look at the shine or look for the shine. But depending on how long you've practiced, some clinicians were. They were taught to put on their loops if you had them at the time. To get your instruments under a light and kind of move that instrument to see if you had a little reflection coming back at you. Well, that reflection coming back at you is that dulled thin razor sharp edge that's begun to round so the light reflects back. Well, I don't know about you, but this is a metal instrument, so everything reflects back, so it's kind of hard to really see the shine or really see what someone may be discussing. So I wanted to show kind of what shine might look like. I do think it's one of the more challenging ways to identify if your instruments are dull. So we're going to go over the easier ways that we'll know if your instruments are dull. I'm sorry, my mouse, there we go. It's being a little bit ornery. I have to adjust my screen for a second. Some additional basic characteristics is just a reminder that a sickle is a triangle in cross section. You have a universal curette that has that beautiful crescent type shape. And then you also have an area specific curette that has one cutting edge. So in these particular images, which I have to give credit to Adam. He's in PDT sharpening department. He leads that department and he is exceptional. So he kind of took off the toe and tip of these instruments for me to be able to show you those cross sections. So it's nice to remind you, you know, I think about when I was young, or for any of you that have children, here we have yellow, it's like a yellow box that has like a star or a circle or a square, and you have all these beautiful shapes that you have to put inside the star, circle, and square and the other shapes. Well, if you're putting a triangle into a circle, that doesn't always work, right? Or trying to fit a half crescent into a triangle, that doesn't always work. So choosing the right instrument really, really does matter when you're thinking about the interproximal and you're thinking about those root fossa and furcation. So we'll look at some of those, and that'll make a bit more sense. The terminal shank, which I mentioned that we're going to focus on, there are so many different styles, right? So if you just look, I mean, here's just 6 instruments, which is a very extremely small sampling of instruments. If you look at these instruments, you have kind of a curved terminal shank. Maybe it has a contrabend to the side. You have a short terminal shank. You have a longer terminal shank, or maybe the terminal shank is straight, which is are like completely straight and in line with the handle, which is much more common for an anterior instrument. But we're going to look at straight versus curved terminal shanks for both the anterior and the posterior. Again, this is just a small, small selection of instruments, and we have hundreds and hundreds of instruments to choose from when we begin to look at what's out there for us as a clinician. So if we continue to look at our instrumentation, let's think about it from a case study perspective. So what instrument will we use? Will we choose and then use? And then when and where are we using that instrument? So let's look at a particular patient that happens to be 73 years old. You'll notice that this patient has a lot of visible recession. There's a root exposure there. You've got crowding in the mandibular anterior. You've also got some torsiversion. And then when you look at the periodontal charting, Oh goodness, we have a lot of periodontal pockets. We're seeing an average of sixes and sevens throughout the mouth. There's also some eights and nines that are visible. So this patient definitely has an active, periodontal disease, and needs to have us properly treat that patient, but also choose the right instruments when we're choosing the different areas of the mouth to instrument. So when we look at the radiographs, and this is always the best part, right? When we get a chance to look at the radiographs. So pick any radiograph on the slide, and you'll see that there is calculus visible on almost every single tooth. We have a super large deposit on the posterior of one. The mandibular anterior has a ton of calculus on it. And like we just want to get in there, right, with our ultrasonics and our piezos, our magnetostrictives, and we are ready to rock and roll. But most people are also going to, after they've selected their ultrasonic of choice and they've removed those larger deposits, most clinicians go back in and they work with their hand instrumentation, or they're detecting prior to instrumentation to identify the calculus that's present. And then we're going in and using our hand instrumentation. So let's look at that. But again, also like lower left quad, oh my goodness, the calculus spurs on that are just, you're just kind of like itching to be able to treat this patient. So let's look at the anterior. If we were particularly working on this patient, there are a lot of different instruments that we could select for the anterior. What I see are some of the most common would be like an H6, H7. A lot of clinicians love that instrument for the anterior. So I would say also a lot of clinicians will approach me and they'll say, I love that. I love that sickle. And I'll say, well, tell me more about it. Like, what's the name of the sickle? Well, it's that sickle that everybody uses on the anterior, but I mean, we kind of use it in the posterior too. But that sickle's my favorite. Well, there are probably, 60 different sickle options out there. So I've learned over the years that most people, when they say, I just love that sickle, it's either a H6, H7, or it's a Nebraska 128, or it may be an H5. So I wanted to kind of show you these from different views, because an H6, H7 has a contra tilt. So you see that in the image to the left. It has just a slight tilt where the shank is going to be to help you adapt that cutting edge. So when I learned about the H6, H7 in school, I was taught that the H6, H7 could be used from premolar to premolar, and that there's a cutting edge on both sides. Well, there's definitely a cutting edge on both sides. Then, when I started teaching full time and I was helping in preclinical skill and doing instrumentation and teaching advanced instrumentation, one of the faculty that I worked with, she had been out of school more than, probably at that time over 20 years. And I'd been out of school for like 5. And she was taught canine to canine and to only use the lower cutting edge. So that's the difference in how we were instructed in that time span of instrumentation, and who taught us at that time. So just because we both used the same instrument, we used it differently. So know that there is a cutting edge on both sides. That contra tilt does help you adapt that lower cutting edge easier to the tooth surface, but you can absolutely tilt it to that mesial or distal and use the other cutting edge. That one's a very common anterior instrument, but of course, because it's a sickle, we would use that supragingivally. So if we look at our anterior image there to the right, we're not going to be able to go deep into that anterior pocket interproximally to get that calculus deposit. A lot of people also love a Nebraska 128. It has a very long terminal shank that's straight, and then a really, really tiny thin sickle. So it's fantastic for crowding, for torsiversion, or any type of crowding in the anterior where you're just like, oh my goodness, this piece of stain, I cannot get it. What is going on? You're going to get out your air polisher, you're going to do something. And if you need an instrument, a Nebraska 128 is tiny, 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 and you will be able to get in the tightest spaces around those line angles, especially when you've got anterior crowding. Another one is an H5. So if you'll notice with the H5 compared to the H6, H7, it just has a straight terminal shank. The actual curve of the sickle itself is very similar. The shank is straight. And some people prefer that because you have more control when it comes to your adaptation. The shank is not tilted for you. So you decide how much angulation that you put based on that tooth, based on the position of that tooth. And then oftentimes the H5 is either paired with, a different instrument on the opposite end. Sometimes it has a spoon on the other end, or it has a Langer 5, for example, on the other end. But I wanted to show you kind of the difference of the most common top three anterior sickles. But there are other things out there. If our patient has unstable periodontium and we can't use those sickles, or we were taught not to use those sickles subgingivally, there are other things that we can use. And one of my favorites, I love a scoop. So I'm going to show you a few more slides on that in just a moment. But when you're working in the anterior, and especially when you have, these large deposits like this, after you've done your ultrasonic instrumentation, you're going back in, you're using that tactile sensitivity to feel any remaining deposits that are there. So I love a scoop for that, especially the one that has an extended shank, or I love like a Gracie 1-2 mini for subgingival access because it has a longer terminal shank. Oftentimes, depending on the design of the instrument, you're going to get an additional 2 or 3 millimeters, maybe even 4, depending on the style. And then also, are you choosing a mini blade? Are you choosing a micro mini blade? Are you choosing something super unique like a O'Hare scoop? And notice that I say scoop instead of spoon. I'm going to show you the difference. So other common instruments that may be used in the anterior would be a Gracie 00, maybe a Gracie 1-2 mini or a micro mini. Some people also love a Langer 5. If you're a fan of the Langers, they function more like a universal curette. So they have similar bends as the Gracies, but they have a cutting edge on both sides. So some people love a Langer 5. Also, a Langer 5 is available in a mini. So when you say mini, you're getting half the length of the blade. So you're able to really adapt into a periodontal pocket. Because if you just think about how narrow the anterior teeth are, if you try to use a traditional length instrument, so let's say I'm working on 23 or 24, and I have a traditional Gracie 1-2, and I need to go deeper into a periodontal pocket, oftentimes the length of that blade is just as wide as the tooth as you go further down onto the root. It may even be wider than the root itself as you're getting, maybe 7, 8 millimeters down, which at that point we're probably referring to a periodontist or doing other procedures. But the further you go down the tooth, we know that it narrows. So a mini or a micro mini is going to allow you to do more effective instrumentation on the root surface, and be able to turn and adapt those cutting edges better. Also, I'll put a Jack Be Nimble in here. It's another sickle, so we would keep using it super gingivally. But the Jack Be Nimble has an even sharper or stronger contra tilt to the side. If you know anything about Paradise Dental Technologies or PDT, PDT is known for the Montana Jack instrument, which universal sickle is not a true textbook term, but a lot of people use the Montana Jack in the anterior or the posterior. So the Jack Be Nimble is kind of a petite version of the Montana Jack. It has a tighter curve to it and a little bit sharper contra tilt. So a lot of people like to use that in the anterior as well, or around ortho. And then we have this O'Hare scoop that I mentioned. So if you've not experienced or you're not familiar with the O'Hare scoops, it's a true scoop. So I tried to do a larger picture for you. So let me just go to the next slide so we can talk about the difference. Some people are familiar with a spoon, but they've not used a scoop or they've not heard about a scoop. So, what's the difference between a scoop and a spoon? So, a spoon has to the left, the image to the left has a kind of wider, flat, like more broad face. So, you see that kind of curve to it. It's a flatter face. and it kind of has that teardrop shaped contour. And all of that is a cutting edge. It also has a much shorter terminal shank. So if you look at the image to the center, you see the adaptation where you're really forced to only use a spoon supragingivally because the terminal shank is so short. As you would try to adapt around the cingulum of an anterior tooth, that terminal shank is going to hit that incisal edge. So you're really only able to adapt it supragingivally. Where when you have a scoop, if we actually go back an image, you can see here on the image to the right that the scoop, this one happens to be an extended shank, can go subgingivally. So you can use a scoop supra or subgingivally, and it has that 300 not a 360, I'm sorry. It has a more round cutting edge, and it has that a deeper concavity. So you're able to do a push or pull stroke with a scoop where you supragingivally or sub, where with a spoon, you're only forced to go supragingival. So then the image to the right here shows a side by side. You're getting a more round shape with a scoop. It's not quite as wide or flat. You're able to do a push or pull, technically with either, but the scoop you can do supra or sub because it's a bit more petite, and then it has a longer shank or a different unique bend. So the scoops are available for the anterior and the posterior. There are some that have similar bends to Gracie. So if you're thinking about furcations and you're thinking about kind of how you would contour to access those calculus deposits in the posterior, there are some great scoop designs for the posterior as well. So I can show you some of those at the end when we go hands-on. So let's talk about the posterior. Don't forget, I'm happy to take any questions. Just put it in the Q&A. I'm more than happy to answer your questions, and I'll go live camera with some instrumentation in front of me here at the end. So when we think about the posterior, we really want to think about the anatomy of a root, right? As we shift into the premolars, some of our premolars do have furcations, right? And then of course, when we get into the molars, I mean, there's so many options, especially if we get into those third molars. They just have a mind of their own. So there are up to 22 possible furcations in the posterior. And that is a lot to think about. And that's just the furcation. That's not thinking about the fossa and the contour of the root leading to that furcation when we have a periodontally involved patient. So the crown and the root can often be a barrier when it comes to the anatomy of the tooth, because if we've not selected the right instrument, then we're already kind of hindering ourselves from being as successful. All right, so let's see on our next, y'all, this arrow keeps escaping me. Oh, goodness, team, we went back to the very beginning. I'm so sorry. I have changed my desk setup, so now let me move my computer. Let me just move look just a bit. There we go. My apologies, team. It's 4:20 my time, AM. Okay, there we go. There we go. So as we move into the posterior and we're thinking about those root fossa and those root furcations, and we're thinking about how, a root is not flat. The teeth are not a sugar cube, right? It's just not flat. There's a lot of contour to the crown. So when we think about the premolars and even for the molars, people often want to use something that's curved. The tooth is curvy, so they want something curved. And then as our patients have a more unstable periodontium, they think about longer terminal shanks or they think about Gracie's. So I wanted to bring up some of the curvy instruments. So some of kind of my favorites for the premolars and even for the posterior, if the patient has stable periodontium, I love a younger good. It has a very similar design as an H6H7. So if you like an H6H7 as an anterior sickle, you may also love a younger good because it has that kind of contra tilt to the terminal shank. It has a beautiful rounded toe where a H6H7 has a tip. You may also like a McCall 1718. That's the image that you see there in the center, or a McCall 1314. They are different in design. So if someone says, oh, I really like a McCall, or are they talking about a 1718, or are they talking about a 1314? Because they have a different design. One has a bit more bend and curve. The other one, kind of similar to a Columbia 1314, but side by side, you would see that they are different. As we shift kind of further into the posterior, or if you like a more straight terminal shank, a lot of people like a Barnhart 5.6, but are they like a Columbia 1314 or a Columbia 4L4R? But what does it actually look like compared side to side? So if you look at the image to the left and you have a Barnhart 5.6, that's the instrument to the right of that image versus, I'm sorry, a Barnhart 5.6 is the instrument to the left of that image versus the 4L4R is the instrument to the right. So you see that a Columbia 4L4R has a longer terminal shank. So if you've never used a Columbia 4L4R, but you like a Barnhart, you wish it was longer, or you like a Columbia 1314, but you wish it was longer, then maybe a Columbia 4L4R is ideal for you. And then if you're like, ooh, I really like this Columbia 4L4R, but I treat a lot of periodontally involved patients. I wish it was just a tad bit longer. Well, then there's a Columbia 2L2R that's even longer than the 4L4R. And then a lot of people don't know that the Barnhart, if you use a Barnhart 5.6, a lot of people are not familiar with the Barnhart 1.2. It is the longest universal curette that you could use. So if you're thinking, I really like this Columbia 2L2R, but I wish it was a bit longer. I kind of like that bend and contour of the Barnhart 5.6. Well, there's a Barnhart 1.2 that doesn't really get a lot of love, but it's a fantastic instrument. And that's the instrument to the far right of the right image. And you see how long that terminal shank is. It is tremendously long. Once we get toward the end, I'll put a link in the chat. On PDT's website, under the downloadable resources, we actually have an instrument comparison guide that has the different millimeters that lets you know, okay, it's 2 millimeters longer than, or if you like this, maybe you would choose this. So it's a really good side by side to learn more about instruments. It is specific to PDT instruments. It doesn't have other manufacturers kind of like specs on there, but it is a really handy tool to have when you're looking at what else is out there and what else could I choose. So let's look at what it would look like, if we were treating a patient. Of course, this is a typodont. I've removed the gingiva so you can actually see. So the image to the left, you have a Barnhart 1.2 on the left versus a Barnhart 5.6. And you see if you're adapting in a very deep posterior pocket, that 5.6, even though it has a longer terminal shank than say a Columbia 1314, if the gingiva was removed, or say there's a flat procedure that we're a part of, you can actually see you're really limited to how deep you can go into the periodontal pocket. So if you select a Barnhart 1.2, you have additional terminal shank to be able to adapt further into the posterior and into a deeper pocket. If you look at the image to the right, you have a Columbia 4L4R on the left versus a Columbia 1314. A lot of clinicians pick up a 1314. It's very popular, like here in Tennessee where I am. A lot of clinicians like a 1314, but as you see, the terminal shank is going to start to hit the cusp of the tooth. And you're not going to be able to actually adapt into a periodontal pocket. I'd say 4 millimeters or less is perfectly fine for a Columbia 1314, but anything more than that, you're really just keeping your fingers crossed that you're actually adapting well enough. You need something with a much longer terminal shank. When you think about the premolars, just a quick anatomy reminder. I used to teach dental anatomy full time. So don't forget that the maxillary first premolar has a mesial crown and root fossa. So as you're doing your instrumentation and you're seeing like this chronic bleeding, or the patient's like, oh, that's tender. Every time I floss there, it bleeds. Don't forget that the contour of the crown and root is continuous and you have that fossa there. It may also have a furcation depending on how much bone loss is there. Now, if it's got a furcation, that tooth is probably not long for this world. It's going to be extracted soon, probably. But just a reminder that that calculus can get on those maxillary first premolars in those root fosses there, those concavities. So, in addition to our Columbias and Barnharts, clinicians love a sickle. And if you think about two teeth, right? Like if you just pretend that my hand and wrist are two teeth, the shape between my wrist is a triangle. So that interproximal shape is triangular in cross section. So that's why we tend to lean towards sickles a lot in the posterior. Though they're, designed and we were taught to only use them supragingivally, a lot of us sneak, maybe we don't admit it unless we're talking to each other, that we also use them subgingivally a little bit, around the CEJ. But you always just want to be very careful when you're using a sickle because it does have a pointed tip. So really popular sickles are 204S or 204SD. And I actually have a slide kind of showing you the 204 family, and that way you can see the difference between those instruments. So we'll get to that one in just a moment. But those are very common posterior instruments. When you think about your molar instrumentation, again, my dental anatomy reminders, don't forget that your mandibular first molar has the shortest root trunk. So when you're doing your instrumentation around the mandibular first molars, then you should be anticipating potentially if your patient, based on your periodontal charting and based on your radiographs, it's very, very common to have a class one furcation on a mandibular first molar if your patient has any type of recession or bone loss because the root trunk is so short. Then your second maxillary molars, and of course those crazy third molars, have the longest root trunk. So if you're getting furcation involvement in those second maxillary molars, then your patient, that tooth is, if you've got some mobility there, I would definitely say you need like a Queen of Hearts, which I'll show you adaptation on that one in just a moment. And then also your Gracies, your ultrasonics, of course, and then of course potential extraction of that tooth when you get into a lot of that bone loss. And then I always mention the third molars because you just never know. Sometimes they're microdontia, they're macro, they're micro, they have fused roots, they have multiple roots. So the third molars are always extremely unique. And sometimes we hope that our patients, maybe they don't have them because they're very hard to adapt to and they're very hard to treat sometimes. But the third molars are always very, very unique. And you do have to have longer terminal shanks to reach to the posterior when your patients do have a third molar present. When we get into those molars, even in the premolar and the anterior, this is just a quick refresher on our Gracies. The most common Gracies that we often see and that people tend to use is a Gracie 1112 paired with a Gracie 1314. But for you all to know or think about, why are there other Gracies, right? There is a Gracie 1516. There is a Gracie 1718. I always had a Gracie 1718, kind of sterilized in a pouch to the side for when I needed to adapt to those third molars. But you can absolutely use it for any of your posterior teeth. And then also a Gracie 1516 has a similar bend design to a Gracie 1314, but but you're going to use it for, the direct buccals, linguals, and mesials, and it's much easier to adapt if you're practicing in a seated position. So if you sit to treat your patients as a clinician and you're using your Gracie 1112 and your wrist is like, I just can't keep my wrist neutral, then you want to get a Gracie 1516. The additional bend helps you keep a neutral wrist as you're reaching to the far posterior and you're coming around to that mesial. So a 1516 would replace your 1112 and help you be more ergonomic when you're working in the posterior. And then, of course, just like our Gracie 00, our Gracie 12, and our minis and our micro minis, you move into the extended reaches. You move into the extended reaches, minis, or rigids. There's so many Gracies to choose from. So if you have really heavy tenacious calculus and you love hand instrumentation, then you would need some rigids, to initially start to treat those calculus deposits versus the minis, micro minis, and extended shanks. And you're going back in and you're doing your fine scaling, post ultrasonic instrumentation. So we could do a whole class just on Gracies and root adaptation, but we've got a lot to cover still. There are also quadrant Gracies, so I want to bring your attention to that. Some of the original quadrant Gracies are an 11-14 paired with a 12-13. We also, PDT offers the Ambitrail Quadrant Gracies. It's a 15-18 paired with a 16-17. So if you're utilizing Quadrant Gracies, you still need two, you still need both, but you're able to do, like, for example, the 15-18, you would select your 15 end, you would do your buckle and measles of quad 4, and then you would continue on doing your buckles and measles, and then instead of putting down that instrument and picking up a separate one, you would flip to your 18 end, and then you could do your distals in quad 4 from the buckle. And then you could move right over to the lingual of quad 3, up to the buckle of 2, to the lingual of 1. So you're making fewer instrument exchanges. And you can do that with the 11-14 and 12-13 quadrant Gracie, or the 15-18, 16-17 quadrant Gracie. So it still takes up two instruments in your set, but you're able to make fewer instrument exchanges, which then helps you as you're not making as many twists and bends. So it really helps you ergonomically. So what instrument would you choose, right? There's so many to choose from. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the Queen of Hearts. This is one that I get questions about all the time. So the Queen of Hearts, though it has a red handle, and I will say it is the only instrument that has a red handle, because a portion of proceeds do go to the Heart Association, because we fully acknowledge, the oral systemic link and everything that's happening in the mouth and how it impacts the rest of the body. So you will not see another instrument available in a red handle from PDT. So the Queen of Hearts, if you look at the different kind of turns and images of the instrument, it is very curvy. It has a 6 millimeter cutting edge, but it is a universal curette. So it has a cutting edge on both sides of each end, but you're going to adapt it a bit differently so you can really maximize the length of that cutting edge. So if you look at the image to the left, I like to insert it vertically into the periodontal pocket, because I want to maximize the full length of the blade. So I insert vertically, and then I adapt the cutting edge, and I'm making horizontal and oblique strokes as I wrap around that distal, the line angle, and then turning into that furcation. So because you have a cutting edge on obviously both sides, and of course the toe, right? The toe is also sharpened, then you're able to turn into those furcations as well, and you can instrument the mesial surface of the distal root into that contour of the furca itself, and then also the distal surface of that mesial root. But my initial insertion is to, well, and I'll go full screen in a moment so you can see, but my initial insertion is I always insert vertically, and then I start my adaptation and work around the line angle. And if you've ever used this instrument, or you're like, I've never used it, but I've heard of it, I'd like to try it, you could still use it like you would your Barnhart or like you would your Columbia, but you're not going to be using the full length of the cutting edge. So you could be making fewer strokes and be more effective if you just change your kind of initial insertion and adaptation point. So the Queen is one of my favorites, and she is fun. Some additional posterior sickles that people like: the Montana 4.5, a 23 Slim, or the Montana Jack, which I mentioned earlier. A Montana 4.5 is, if you love a 204S, but you wish it was like a rigid 204S, you wish it had a longer shank, a longer cutting edge, that would be a Montana 4.5. It's kind of like I won't say giant, because no instrument's really a giant, but it is a much larger version of like a 204S. Longer terminal shank, a thicker shank, longer blade. A 23 Slim, I liken it more to like a Columbia 4L, 4R, but a sickle version. So longer terminal shank, a thin blade. It is still a sickle, great for adapting in the posterior interproximally, but more like a Columbia 4L, 4R, but a sickle version. So you don't have to take your Columbia and sharpen it into a sickle, or you don't have to take your 23 Slim and turn it into a Columbia 4L, 4R. Because if you've kind of made your own instruments, I promise there's typically a version out there that's like that. And if there's not, call me and we'll try to make one, right? It's always fun to design instruments. And I didn't mention that, but the Queen of Hearts was actually designed in partnership with a dental hygienist who just, wanted, took a original instrument design, but said this could be better if, and then worked with Linda Miller, who's the CEO and founder of PDT, still the CEO and founder. She works in the office every day. And they work together to make a beautiful instrument that really was nothing like the original design. And it's perfect for clinicians. So we partner with clinicians often to design instruments. So I mentioned earlier that we were going to talk about kind of the 204S family. Say this is family, maybe it's brothers and sisters and cousins, right? But a lot of people love a 204S. Very short terminal shank, short blade, so therefore obviously a short cutting edge. Again, healthy, stable periodontium, pediatric patients. You're not going subgingivally with this. The terminal shank just doesn't allow you to. You're not being effective if you're trying to force it subgingivally. So then clinicians like a 204 SD. So the 204 SD, you'll notice that the terminal shank kind of opens up a little bit. So a lot of people like this for the distals or further in the posterior. You can absolutely still use it interproximally, but it's not quite as tight of a bend. The 204S is like 90, 90, 90. It's like really sharp bends, where a 204 SD has a bit more open bend. Then you get into a 204 IUFW. It's Indiana University at Fort Wayne. That really looks like a completely different instrument, but they still call it a 204 design because it has kind of those similar initial bends in the functional shank going into the terminal shank. It is longer, it is more open. You can reach further into the posterior or further interproximally, depending on how much bone loss that patient may have. And then also, now I put the 220 here, so it's not a 20, it's not a 204. I'm doing quotes if you can't see me. It's not a 204, but people will ask about a 220. They'll ask about a Katani, other or a 135, like all these other sickles that are out there that people, just happen upon, depending on if you're, practicing somewhere else or you're temping or, you've started at a new clinic. But a 220 is robust. It has a thick terminal shank. It has a bit longer blade. It has a bit wider blade. It is a 220. It's not a 204, like I said. But you just see in just looking at these four instruments, you could accidentally say, "Oh, I want a 204." And if someone's helping you place your order or identify the instrument number, oh my goodness, you could end up with something that you didn't even know about or that you haven't had a chance to use, but maybe you love it because there are three different 204 options available. So there's a lot for us out there. So we're going to transition into instrument sharpening. So please, again, if you have any questions, use the Q&A. I'm happy to take questions for you, but we're going to transition into why a sharp instrument matters, right? So now that we've talked about our instrument selection and we've chosen the correct instrument, and we're thinking a little bit differently about for periodontal patients, do I have the right instruments in my kit? Should I have something with a longer terminal shank? Do I want to try something with a curvy terminal shank, like that McCall 1718 or the Queen of Hearts? Or do I really like a more straight terminal shank, like a Barnhart 5.6? But I've always thought my Barnhart 5.6 should be longer, so maybe I need to try a Barnhart 1.2. Or I've only ever tried a Columbia 1314, so maybe I want to try the Columbia 4L4R or the Columbia 2L2R. So in selecting those instruments and making the right choice for you and for your patient, we also have to make sure that those instruments are sharp because that matters, right? Your selection matters and how sharp they are matters because you could be working so much harder than you have to be if your instruments are not sharp. So when you're identifying a dull instrument, at the very, very beginning, we talked about shine. I showed you that picture of like how some clinicians were taught to look for the shine, but I mean, it is a metal instrument, so it all shines. It all shines back. So that is a honed skill that you really would have to really have your loops on, have a good light on. But there are so many other ways that we know as clinicians on how to identify a dull instrument. It has reduced biting ability. Maybe we're burnishing calculus instead of popping it off. We're noticing that we're putting more increased lateral pressure, or we're making additional strokes, or we're saying, oh my goodness, my hand, my wrist, my fingers, like I have hand and wrist fatigue. I won't even say at the end of the day, because it could be after a patient, it could be after a single patient, depending on how much hand instrumentation you're doing. If your instrument's dull, if you've not selected the right instrument to remove that deposit or to adapt to that root area. And then also the patient may just be in general uncomfortable. They may not complain to you, but maybe they made a comment to the front desk and said, "Oh my gosh, that was really uncomfortable." They were kind of rough, or they put a lot of pressure, or like they really had a hard time cleaning my teeth. Well, and it could be because the instruments are dull or the wrong instrument was selected. So we know as a clinician when it's not as sharp. We can feel it in our fingertips, right? We don't always have to look for the shine, but we also want to make sure that we're checking it for sharpness, and then we also know how to sharpen. So when it comes to sharpening, and we saw some images like this at the beginning, right? We looked at images in cross section from a sickle to a universal curette to an area specific curette. But when we're actually sharpening and we kind of look at similar images again, the correct angulation, you're keeping that bevel intact. It's aligned with the face, so you're creating that cutting edge. Versus the image to the middle, you don't have enough angulation. So if you look at the middle image, but the left side of that, I mean, it's kind of just almost blunted off. So the stone was too straight up and down. It didn't have the correct clock position. And then also, if you look at the image to the right, it's too much angulation. You're way over here at 120 degrees trying to sharpen. So sharpening is challenging. And I don't think anybody says, oh, I disagree with you. Sharpening's easy. It can be made easier when you have the proper knowledge, or you have maybe a tool to help you, or you're really focused, or you're just really good at geometry, because when you're getting that 105 110 degree angulation, you're trying to keep your 15-degree bevel, and I mean, like, it's really a lot of geometry. And I don't know about you all, but I think I took geometry in the 10th grade, and that was a long time ago. So sometimes that is hard. So in addition to feeling it in our fingertips when we're treating our patients, you do always want to check your instruments for sharpness before you sharpen them. Because what if, you've got a set of, like, say, 5, 6, 7 instruments, depending on whether you're treating a stable or unstable periodontium patient. So maybe all of them don't need to be sharpened. So you want to make sure that when you're sharpening your instruments, you're checking each instrument before you begin sharpening, because you don't want to over sharpen, right? I mean, it can only be so sharp, you all. If you're doing a good job sharpening it, once it is sharp, it is sharp. Right. And then we resharpen it again when it begins to dull. So if it doesn't need to be sharpened, please don't sharpen it, because you're removing additional metal, or you're possibly recontouring the instrument if you're not using something that actually kind of helps you stay in line, or keeps your angulation correct. So that's where I say sharpening can be made easy, because there are products, like the Gleason. There are a lot of different sharpening products out there. If I'm being unbiased as a clinician, there are so many different sharpening products out there. However, there aren't a lot that keep you at the correct angulation, or if you're using something that's rotary, or that is battery powered, or powered by electricity, you could be taking off a lot more metal than you need to be, because if you're putting pressure and you're moving, and maybe a stone's moving, and you're kind of doing double time, you could be removing a lot of excess metal, and kind of reducing the lifespan of your instruments. Where when you have something a bit more manual, but that still helps you keep you in position, you have more control, and you can really, really feel in your strokes, and then check as often as possible. So I like to make 3 or 4 strokes and then check for sharpness before I go again. Because remember, when it's sharp, it's sharp. It's not going to get sharper. You're just sharpening correctly or incorrectly. So these, I'm going to kind of go live camera in just a second, but here's some images of what I like to use. It's called the Gleason Guide. So it has a side for a universal or sickle, and it has a side for a Gracie curette. It also has a toe shaper at the end. So I still have control. Maybe it's my type A dental hygienist personality. I don't know. Y'all could probably agree with me, maybe some of us on that, but I like that I still have control. I get to hold it in my hand and I can feel it. So I want to spend this last bit of time together actually showing you how to sharpen, and how I like to sharpen, and then take any questions that you have. Show you any additional instruments that you might like to see. I have several typodonts. I have several instruments. I'm happy to do some demonstrations for you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to change my camera view. That way you all can see a bit differently. All right. And then it should let me, or John, you may have to help me. Sometimes it will let me
That's
do it.
perfect,
You,
Whitney. Yep.
it is
I
good.
can
Okay.
I
Sometimes
can
you
see
may,
the scalers and the Gleason guide. Yep.
okay. And then it may give you the option to, does it give you the option to spotlight? So is it full screen for you all, or is it a little tiny square?
It's a smaller square.
Okay. So you may
Um,
see an option that says spotlight speaker or spotlight presenter. Let's see. What about now? Is it a big square?
no. Oh,
Okay.
yeah. It's sorry. You and I were presenters. It's smaller screen, but you can. Yes, everyone, all the attendees can see full screen.
Okay, perfect. That's what I was hoping for. I didn't
Yep.
want to be a
Perfect.
tiny little square if everyone could see a little bit larger. Okay, perfect. We got it. Technical difficulties at 4 a.m. for me. Okay, so I've got my setup here. So I have a Gleason guide. The white stone that you see here, this is a fine stone. And then this kind of gray brown color, this is a coarse stone. So I rarely use a coarse stone. So I'm going to go ahead and put it to the side, because a coarse stone is more of a transformation stone. Like, uh-oh, I turned my Columbia 1314 into a 204S. Can I get it back to a toe? And most of the time, it's very challenging to do that. So I always pick up a fine stone, because you only want to sharpen as much as you need. So with a Gleason guide, you actually put the stone in your fingertips. You put the Gleason guide on top, and you make sure that you're aligning the stone underneath kind of the viewing window there, or the little trough or trench. People kind of call it a different area. When you look at the sharpening guide, the center portion here is called the stop. These outer edges are called the rest, because you're going to rest your terminal shank there. And then you also have the toe shaper that you would use if it is a curette. So always hold it in your fingertip. I tuck my fingertips underneath. I use my thumb on top for stability. And then I'm ready to go. So let's just say I choose a sickle. This happens to be an H5. Remember, we talked about a nice straight terminal shank. So if I choose a sickle, I'm going to position the back of the instrument on the stone with the terminal shank against the stop. So let me turn it sideways so you can see. And I'll completely reposition so you can really see. So the terminal shank is against the stop. I'm not doing anything crazy. I'm not going to do any of this crazy stuff. The back of the instrument's on the stone. The terminal shank is against the stop. Okay, that is the starting position. So now I'm a right-handed clinician. So again, I'm holding my Gleason guide and my stone. Some people also like to put their fingertip on of their index finger on the top for additional stability. You just kind of have to figure out what feels best for you. So I'm going to get my starting position. The back of the instrument is on the stone. The terminal shank is against the stop. And then I'm resting on to the rest. So now my terminal shank is touching that outer piece of metal called the rest. And that outer piece of metal is actually angled. And that's keeping me at the correct angulation for my cutting edge. And then you're going to make a pendulum type motion. So instead of just dragging it straight back and forth, you still have to think heel, middle, side of the tip, just like if you were sharpening just with your hand and stone. So I'm stopping, I'm resting, and then notice the motion. So heel, middle, side of the tip. I'm staying in. I'm staying in that opening that you can see. And it's all wrist. Let me just show you. It's all wrist. Like my fingertips are not moving. And I'm going to go real slow. So like side of the tip, middle heel. And I'm just staying in that area doing this motion. Now, when you're sharpening, you want to make sure that you have a ping ring or a test stick that we saw on the previous slide. So if you like a ping ring, you can put it on your index finger. So I could be just like this. I could do my sharpening strokes. And then instead of having to put this down, I can just turn and oh, still a little bit dull. So when you check for sharpness, you want to make sure if you're completely in line with with the ping ring, then it's always going to feel dull. If you've got to tilt that cutting edge down, just like you're going to adapt it to the tooth. So I need a little more pressure there. So I would go back, rest, and I'm going to do a little more pressure, make a few strokes, and then I'm going to check again. And then just like if you're checking on a test stick, some people like to use a saliva ejector, you're going to catch into that material. Now that would be an example of a sickle. And of course I would sharpen the other side. It's a little bit harder without me blocking my camera view, but I would reposition, I would rest, and I would do that same kind of pendulum type motion. You want to make sure that your terminal shank is always touching. You're not overcompensating. You're not turning. You're not dragging the tip of the instrument on the stop. You're just always keeping the terminal shank on the rest and the lateral side of the instrument on the stone. So you would use that same section for universals or sickles. So let's say I pick up my Columbia 1314 now. Same thing. I'm going to stop. I'm going to rest, and I'm going to start that same motion where I'm doing the side of the toe, the middle heel, side of the toe, middle heel. Now, the biggest difference, I'm going to swap into the opposing side. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to rest. And then also, if I was not holding this in my hands, let's say it was flat on my countertop, I'm in my operatory, everything's sterile, I'm sharpening. If I were in my operatory and this was on the countertop, I'd start to hit the countertop. So you want to always keep it in your hand. So depending on the instrument design, you would not be able to correctly adapt if this was flat on a table. So I want you to know that. Now, because I have a curette, I'm going to use the toe shaper, and I'm going to, and see how it's kind of slanted. Let me turn it to the side. So it's slanted here. So I'm going to use the toe shaper. And the thing about the Gleason guide, it is truly just a guide. Like it itself is not sharpening. It is keeping you in the correct angulation as you are sharpening. So you control the number of strokes, you control the amount of pressure, and then you are the one checking for sharpness. So the toe shaper is slanted. You would slide down the slant. And I'll go back to that slide that we looked at. That way the back of the instrument is on the slant. And then I like to fulcrum on the end of the stone. And though I don't have super long fingers, I kind of back up the toe shaper a bit to give me a little bit of, just makes it a little more comfortable for me. So I fulcrum on the end, you slide down the slope, and then you make kind of like I used to say fishtail, but then somebody said, no, it's more like a mermaid. I said, okay, more like a mermaid. Right, I guess. So you just kind of do this back and forth kind of rounded motion where you're just rounding that toe. You're keeping the toe round. And then we would do the exact same thing if it was a Gracie. We would identify our terminal shank. I see that this left side is my lower cutting edge. Remember, we only want to sharpen one side of our Gracie. I did swap sides. If you notice, I probably did it a little too quick out of habit, but I rotated sides of my Gleason guide. I'm now on the Gracie side. I'm going to position the back of the instrument on the stone. I'm going to rest the terminal shank on that outer edge, and I'm going to make that pendulum type motion where heel, middle side of the toe, just that one side. Then I'm going to go and I'm going to round my toe again. And then I would check for sharpness. So I want to pull up the Q&A just in case there's a question.
Yeah, just
So
one. Sorry, we've got one from Peter Chung. In terms of, do we need to put oil in for sharpening?
yeah, thank you, Peter. I see a question from Tanya or Tanya also.
And Tanya,
So
yeah,
this is a ceramic stone,
yeah,
so it does not require oil or water. Neither one are required. Just a traditional stone. I'll always have a sterile stone prior to sharpening. So therefore, your instruments are sterile, your stone is sterile, and you are ready to reprocess and sterilize. Yeah, great question. But no oil, no water. Now, if you're using like an India stone or an Arkansas stone, you do want to make sure that you're familiar with the instructions for use with those particular stones because they are more of a natural stone and often do require oil or water. But when you're using a ceramic stone, oil nor water is required. Yeah, that's a great question. Good questions.
Any
Any
other
other
questions
questions?
for anybody? That's been great, Whitney. Very informative and yeah, really great, interesting demonstration of instruments plus sharpening. I'll just give a few minutes for any questions from anybody further to come through. In the meantime, thank you very much, Whitney, for sharing your expertise and practical
Yeah.
insights with us tonight. I think we can all agree that was incredibly valuable. A great session on how to get the most out of our instruments and sharpening techniques. Thank you also,
Thank you
everybody,
so
for joining us
much.
this evening. We
Thank
know
you
how
so
busy your
much,
schedules
John.
are. I'm just, I'll just about, we really appreciate the time you've taken to join us, and I'm just about to announce the 10 lucky winners of the PDT Moose, which will be in contact shortly after the webinar to confirm delivery details. So Yen Ping Wang, Tian Fitzgerald, Claire Jelinek, Willem Cranju, Stephen Suster, and that's the 10. So we will be in touch with you further. Also, please take the opportunity to meet Whitney in person at OHAA on the Gold Coast on the 16th to the 18th of October. If you'd like to learn more about PD instruments or sharpening solutions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Arc Health team. We're here to help you find the right tools to support your practice. PDT instruments are also easy to find on archealth.com.au. We'll also be sharing a replay link and webinar exclusive promotion, so keep an eye on your inbox in the coming days. On behalf of PDT and Arc Health, thank you again for being part of tonight's session. Stay safe and keep smiling. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I will also
Pleasure.
say the promotion that you all have going on, because now the course is over, right? We can talk a little bit of business. Um, the promotion that you all have, the buy four and save 20%, that's a fantastic deal. So, and then you get a free ping ring, and then y'all got a chance to win the mooses tonight. And
Yeah,
then also, people often ask, like, how do I get in touch with Arc Health that John mentioned? You can go to archealth.com.au. Also, a PDT is available at Metadent. So I wanted to put up this contact information for everyone as well. But reach out to
great.
to John or one of your Arc Health partners. But they have a great deal for you for attending the webinar. So I think That's very kind of you all. And again, thank you so much for inviting Elizabeth and I to be here and for PDT to be here. And I can't wait to visit you all in Australia. And I'll be at the conference in the Gold Coast. So I'm so excited to see you all there.
That'll be great. Any further questions? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much. Have a lovely evening.
Have a lovely evening. Thank you, everyone.